In one section of his book, Herodotus explains or describes the tribes that lived in Libya, which is a word that was used in place of Africa. By then, they didn't call Africa Africa, they called it Libya. So he tells us about the tribes that lived in Libya, and Libya to Herodotus and I guess to the scholars of this time did not include Egypt. Egypt was on its own, and then there was Libya, and Ethiopia was also not mentioned as part of Libya. It was on its own. So Africa was Egypt, Ethiopia, and Libya. Now, we also need to bear in mind that the south of Africa, especially starting at the Sahel going to the south, was not well known to the people of Egypt and Greece and that world of which was the world that Herodotus knew. But it takes a moment to explain or to describe the tribes that lived in Libya. But I was going through these tribes of reading that part very carefully, and I noticed that we could say he was describing tribes that lived in what we know today as North Africa, and to some extent what we know as the Sahel. So North Africa, that is Libya, the country, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and then you come to the Sahel, maybe Chad, Niger, Mauritania. Yeah, so those countries, it's what the tribes he talks about are found in that region. In some other parts of the book, he does mention that to the south, where is we could call maybe the more forested part of the continent, he talks about dwarvish people living there. Yeah, so and I've created a video before about that. Now, let's go through some of the tribes he mentions that were found in Libya. Some of them he just mentions by just name and he doesn't give much information about them. But some of them he gives very interesting information about. But before I go into that, let me mention that he does say that the people who lived in Libya were into two major groups. There were the indigenous tribes that were there originally. That's like 2,000 years ago. So, but they would still have that distinction. And there were new people who came into the land and settled. That's the Phoenicians that founded their own kingdom, the Carthage. They have the Phoenicians and the Greeks who came into that land. So he divides them into two bigger groups: the people who came from outside and settled, and there were the indigenous. In this case, in this part of the book, he decides to focus more on the indigenous tribes. So, and before I also go into the tribes, I need to point out that he does use some landmark to describe where these tribes lived. And one of the landmark that he uses a lot is River Triton, and a lake that was known as Tritonis. Now, these two are no longer in existence. I was trying to do some research to see. So it seems like it's a huge lake that to be somewhere, maybe Morocco, Algeria, somewhere there. It was a huge lake with even islands that were occupied, and there was this river that went into it. But we no longer have that River Triton. We no longer have like Tritonis, but he uses them to say the tribes that live to the east of Lake Tritonis, and that is now the section between Egypt and that lake. They were mostly pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists. They kept animals and they moved around. And then the tribes that lived to the west of Lake Tritonis, they were more farmers, people who were more settled. And then now people to the south of the lake, maybe now towards the Sahel and the southern part, to a large extent, Herodotus says that land was unoccupied. And except for a few wild people, mostly dwarfish people. I've mentioned this before. Now, let's go to specific tribes. Now, he starts by describing tribes that were next to Egypt going to the west. That's how he decides to do it. And then at some point it goes to the south, but generally it goes to the west. Now, he tells us that at the border of Egypt to the west, there was a tribe called the Adrimachidae, and he tells us this tribe were in many ways similar to Egyptians. They were not much different to Egyptians, except that their dressing was different. They dressed like the rest of the Libyans. And then they had this custom that stood out for me, that every year young maidens who are about at the age of getting married were brought into kind of like a festival, and then the king will pick one or two he likes, and then the rest will be married off to the other men. And this sounds so similar to what happens in Swaziland. If you know anything about Swaziland, the king of Swaziland, King Mswati, every year picks one girl from a festival that is held, and young girls are brought, maybe girls 16, 17, 18 years, 20, and then he picks one girl, and then the rest now will go and other people will pick them for marriage. So that sounded similar, and that caught my attention. Then next to this tribe, there were the Giligamai, who were there next to that, the initial tribe, the Adimakidae. It doesn't give us much, or there wasn't much interesting information about them. Then there is the Asibastai, then there is the Akisai, and then there is the Kabbalians, and then there is this Nasamonians. Now, Nasamonians stood out for me because in another part of the book, he talks about young men from that tribe crossing the Sahara, going into the south to find out what is there, and they find that the south is forested, full of animals, but then there's these tribes of very short people who live there. And they say that they saw those people like they were practicing sorcery or something like that. So some of the information we learn about the south of the Sahara comes from these Nasamonians. Or Herodotus collects some information about the southern part of Africa from these Nasamonians. And he tells us that the Nasamonians were very numerous. They had a very big population. They were pastoralists. And he also mentioned something that caught my attention, that they used to catch locusts and dry them and then crush them into a powder and then add that powder into milk. Milk they took. And that was interesting because where I come from, we eat locusts, and I was trying to think, so how does this taste with milk? Okay. Then they married many wives. That's the Nasamonians. And that's pretty much what I caught my attention about the Nasamonians. Then there were the Psylli, which is spelled P-S-Y-L-L-I. Now this tribe, he says that this tribe refused completely to interact with other tribes. They kept away from other tribes. They didn't do trade with others. They didn't interact with any other tribe. They kept to themselves. And he says that this tribe also did not fight. They were not warlike. They did not even have weapons. They could not defend themselves. If they were attacked, they just ran away. They refused to be in interaction with other tribes. And then next to them, there were the Garamantians. Now, these ones were like to the south of the Nasamonians. And he tells us that the Garamantians were they were very good with horses and having this. He says that in fact the Greeks learned some of how to use horses from them and tie and what we call it, like having horses pull carriages. They learned from the Garamantians. And then we have the Masia to the west. Nothing much, except that what caught my attention is that they They grew their hair into locks, like we call it rasta. Um, and then they used skins of ostriches to create shields. Um, Now, here is the most interesting part about the Masia. Sorry, I say that I didn't get something. This is the most interesting part. In this tribe, the Masia, no, it's not the Masia, sorry. The Masia, nothing much. They use skins of ostriches to create shields. That's all. Now, the most interesting tribe is the Gindanis. Now, the Gindanis, among the Gindanis, um, women were allowed to have as many lovers as they wished. And for every man that slept with a woman, he had to give her a leg anklet made of leather. So if a woman slept with a man, the man had to give them that anklet made of leather, and then they will wear it on their ankle. Now, the woman who managed to get, so every man a woman slept with will give them that anklet made of leather. And so that meant if they slept with many men, that the number of those anklets will be many, of course. Now, their view of morality was kind of different from what we think of today in most parts of the world. For them, it didn't sound bad that a woman had slept with many men. For them, in fact, it was something to be proud of. So they say that a woman who had the most of those anklets was like celebrated in the community, because it was a sign that she was admired the most, she was liked the most, she was the most beautiful. So it is the opposite of what we'll think today, that if a woman slept with many men, then it will be seen like it's a part of her life she might want to hide. Among the Gindanis, it was something that was celebrated. And then I noticed that there's another tribe in Africa today that does something similar. It's still in existence. They are called the Wadabi. Wadabi is a sub-tribe of the Fulani, I think, and they live in the Niger and Chad and some part of the Sahel region. I don't know whether it's the same tribe, could be, or maybe it's a different tribe with the same practices. Among the Wadabi, the women are allowed to have as many men as they want, and in fact, they do hold what you can call a beauty pageant for men and women. Even the married women are allowed to pick the men they find attractive, and they can have relations with them, and it's no big thing among that tribe. I don't know whether the Wadabi and the Gindanis are related. Maybe they are, maybe not, but I picked that. And then there's a tribe of the Lotopagi. This tribe used to eat the fruits of the lotus tree, and that's all they consume, nothing else. I found that interesting. And they lived next to the Tritonis, Lake Tritonis. And then there are other tribes that lived next to Lake Tritonis, included the Ausians, yes, and the Macleans. Now, then there were the Ammonians, nothing much he mentioned that, except in the other parts of the book he does mention the oracle of Ammon was very popular even among the Greeks. They used to travel to go and consult the oracle of Ammon, which was a temple in the land that was occupied by the Ammonians. And then there were the Troglodytes, and Herodotus tells us that this is a tribe of people who were related to Ethiopians. They lived not in Ethiopia, but they were related to Ethiopians. And then there were the Atlanteans. Now, the Atlanteans also have a very interesting custom. Herodotus tells us that among the Atlanteans, nobody had a name. Like they used not to name people. And this was interesting, because there was a time I was thinking, what happens if people are not named? Like you're born and you're not given a name. Because we grow with the name being a very important component of our identity. So there was a time I was thinking, what happens if you are not given a name? Then how do you think about your identity without a name? So then I come across the Atarantians. Herodotus tells us that in their community, their tribe, people used not to be given names. The only name everyone had is the name of Atarantian. That's the only name you are. So, and everybody was Atarantian. That was it's interesting. I don't know how they lived. Must have been okay with them. Must have been normal with them that nobody has a name. All of us are Atarantians. And then there are the Marxians. They now to the west of Lake Tritonis. Now we have the Marxians. We have the uh, now the Marxians used to claim that they came from they were descendants of men from Troy in Greece, and they used to smear their body with red paint. Which is interesting because in Africa there are so many tribes that still paint their body with red paint. The Maasai is an example of that. So these people used to paint their body with red paint, and they used to claim that their fathers came from Troy, meaning their mothers were from other tribes in Africa or in Libya then. And then we have the Savasians. Now, Savasians is another tribe that lived to the west of Lake Tritonis. And the interesting thing about this tribe is that their women went to battle with their men, just like the Amazons in Greece or in Europe. Now we have this tribe in Africa or in Libya whose women used to go to war with the men. They didn't stay at home. And then we have the Byzantians, still living to the west of Tritonis, Lake Tritonis. And the interesting thing about them was that they ate monkeys. So these are some of the tribes that Herodotus lists and talks about in the book, tribes of Libya, which to him Libya meant Africa. But of course, it didn't include the entire of Africa because there was this other southern section that was not very much known to Herodotus and people of his time. Yeah, so those are the tribes of Libya according to Herodotus.